story from Iceland called The Fearless Boy, or possibly The Boy Who Knew No Fear. There was, a long time ago, a boy who grew up whose parents cared for him very much, but they found it a bit difficult to bond with him because he didn't really show very much feeling, and it was really difficult to get him to be afraid of anything. And so there came a time when the boy's parents had decided that obviously he needed someone else to teach him how to feel. And so they sent him off to the local priest. And the local priest took him in because he was a big, strapping lad, hard working. And so the lad worked very hard for the priest on his farm, and all went well. Until the priest decided there had come the time when he really needed to he needed to teach the young man how to be afraid. And so the priest said, I left a book on the altar in the church, but I need that book this evening. Will you go to the church and bring me the book? It's placed on the altar. It was a dark night, but the young man walked through the churchyard, down the aisle. But as he walked down the aisle, there seemed to be something in the way. So he humped. And he realised that what was in the way were 3 dead bodies. There had been an avalanche a few days before, and 3 people had sadly been killed, and their bodies had been laid out in the church awaiting burial. So the lad simply lifted up each body and placed it to one side so they were out of his way, probably on the benches because he was a big strong lad. He went to the altar, found the book that the priest wanted, and took it back to the priest's house. And the priest looked at him and thought, well, he doesn't really seem to be showing much signs of having had any scary experiences. And so the priest thanked the young man for bringing him the book and then said, so did anything happen in the church? And the young man said, well, there were some dead bodies in the way, but I just picked them up and just moved them out of my way. And the priest was so horrified. The young man's, I don't know, I suppose it's not so much lack of fear as lack of respect for the dead. That the next day he gave the young man a new pair of shoes, some new clothes, some food, his heartfelt best wishes, and sent him on his way. So the young man didn't really know what to do. He couldn't really go back to his parents, so he just walked. And he found himself down in the south of the island, where the bishop had recently passed away. And he found work on the farm, and the first day all went well. He worked hard. He's a strong, hard-working lad, you know. So he worked hard, And as the sun set and everyone finished work, he thought, he all went back to the farmhouse. And the young man was expecting to be given some wool work. Because in the evenings, people sat maybe carding wool. And generally, it's always something to do on a farm, isn't there? By the light of the oil lamps. Didn't really have candles. They had lamps, which in which they burned fish oil, and it cast more shadow than light. And the lad was a bit surprised when everyone else went to leave. He said, why are you leaving? Why are you going out into the night? And they said, we can't stay here. Since the bishop died, there's a terrible ghost that haunts the farm. And the young man looked at them. They all left and he stayed in the farm. He thought, I'm not letting any old ghost bother me. I'm going to stay here for the night. So he bedded down. And after a little while, he was woken up by a sound coming from the chimney. And a very deep voice, this is as deep as I can get, a very deep voice said, can I fall down? The young man said, there's nothing to stop you. And with a crash, a torso appeared in the ash at the bottom of the chimney, shortly followed by a pair of legs and a pair of arms and a head. And by some strange magic, the head and the body and the limbs all joined together. And an ugly, wizened man appeared in the room. And he lifted up one of the floorboards and dragged out from under the floorboard a wooden chest. And in the wooden chest, go on, you've already guessed, haven't you? Yes. In the wooden chest were lots of silver coins. No, it's not gold, actually. It's silver. There were lots of silver coins. And the ghost just lifted up the silver and let them run through his fingers like rain, and just played with them. And as he did, one of the coins just rolled a little way away. And so the young man picked up the stray coin. Well, you would, wouldn't you? So after a little while, the ghost grew tired of playing with, but he realised that one coin was missing. So after a brief exchange of words, the young man gave the ghost back his silver coin. And the ghost disappeared. It doesn't say whether he went back up the chimney or how else he got out of the house, but somehow or other the ghost disappeared. So when day dawned and all the other workers came back to the farm, they were really pleased to see the young man still there and still alive, because everyone else who had stayed in their farmhouse had simply died of fright at the sight of the ghost. So the second night, the young man was ready for him. And he took the chest of silver coins and hid it. So when the ghost came down the chimney, lifted up the floorboard and found his chest of precious silver had gone, he went to try and attack the young man. But the young man was ready for him, and he stood by the door, And as the ghost ran towards him, the young man simply opened the door, and the ghost ran out into the dark night and fell down a crevice, was swallowed by the earth, and was never seen again. So the following day, the young man related the story to the other farm workers, and of course they thought he was a bit strange, but they were probably quite grateful that the ghost had gone. So the young man decided that he would like to go in search of more adventure. So the next day, off he set, and he walked for some time until he found a cave. And laid out on the floor of the cave were 7 sheepskins. And he looked around at the cave, and it was incredibly messy. So he kind of tidied everything. I really hope he never comes to my house. And there was a cauldron by the fire, and there was some meat and maybe a few herbs. And so the young man unsheathed his knife, cut up the meat, and cooked it over the fire. And the sun was just setting as 7 men walked into the cave, battle-scarred and weary. But they were very grateful to the young man for having cleaned the cave and having cooked a meal. So they all sat down together and ate. And they said to the young man, "You can stay. You can stay with us." And so he agreed that he would stay in the cave and cook and look after the cave. And every day the 7 men would leave, and they would come back tired, bleeding, battle-scarred and weary. And after a few days, the leader explained that they were all outlaws. They were all outcasts. They were people who had been thrown out. And for some time they had lived happily. They had a flock of sheep that they tended, and they went fishing. They could feed themselves. They knew which plants to harvest. But then there came a time when 3 ghosts appeared. And so every day there was a fight between the 3 ghosts and the 7 men, and every day the ghosts would win. And the men were getting more and more tired. So the young man was quite intrigued by this, so he followed them. He wanted to watch what really happened. What really happened was just as the outlaws' leader had described, that there were 3 ghosts who fought. At the end of the day, as the 7 men were making their weary way back to the cave, the boy watched, and an old lady, withered and shrunken, appeared, all dressed in blue, and she had with her a pot of ointment, and she smeared it on the ghost's wounds. There was even one ghost whose head had been cut off, and she picked up his head and placed it back on and smeared the ointment round his neck. And hey presto, he was as good as new. So, once the ghosts had gone to wherever it was they went to at night, the young man overpowered the old woman and took the jar of ointment. When he went back to the cave that night, he had the marvellous jar of ointment with which to heal all the outlaw's wounds. And they said, "We think the ghosts are men that we wronged a long time ago." The next day, at the end of the day, and when that day's fight was over, it was the young man who, I was about to say killed the ghosts, but that doesn't make sense, does it, actually? But finally laid those 3 troubled spirits to rest. So he went back to the cave, and of course the men all had their jar of ointment. So things changed. And instead of fighting the ghosts, the men spent their time training and fighting each other. And of course, they had their jar of marvellous ointment. And they found that the young man's story was true, that you could even cut off someone. Don't try this at home, by the way. You could even cut off someone's head, put the head back on, and so there came a time when the young man found him. The young man was accidentally, I assume accidentally, decapitated during one of their training fights. And they put his head on back to front, and when he stood up, he found himself looking at his own arse, which is probably not a pleasant sight, is it? And when he tried to walk forwards, he found himself walking backwards. So they took off his head again and put it back on the right way round, and with the magical ointment. So after all these adventures, the young man decided there was only one place left to go, and that was to go home, to go back to his parents. And by now he had learned, well, he learned the meaning of fear. He learned the meaning of comradeship and love and all sorts of things. So the young man went home to his own family, his own parents, not bearing gifts of silver or treasure, but bearing a heart that had learned to care. So perhaps that is a happy ever after. Do you think so? You'll have to work it out for yourselves. Anyway, that a lot of the images in that story do appear in lots of other stories. But in the world of storytelling, anything is possible. So do subscribe to my channel. Do listen to some of my other stories. And I do hope to see you again soon. Take care.